Last year I made a video review of the first Deadly Dozen game, and I recommend you watch that review before you watch this review of the second game. To convince you to give it a watch, here's the one and only person who called it the best video I've ever made.
And I just
it's the best video you've done, but that's my bias.
So here we are. It's October 31st of 2002, and N-Fusion and Infogrames just released Deadly Dozen Pacific Theater exactly 1 year to the day after the original game. Reviews are out, and they're generally much more positive this time around. After some quick detective work, it's apparent this game is set on World War II's Pacific Theater. And from the outset, it's otherwise a very similar game to the first, as it runs on the same proprietary engine, it controls the same, has the same structure except there's 12 missions now instead of 10, and it even reuses some of the assets from the original game. Play cooperatively over LAN or the internet, ellipses, or take on your friends in a deathmatch. Joke's on you, Deadly Dozen, I have no friends. This is an entirely single-player review, so keep that in mind, and I'm continuing my semi-permadeath no quick save style of playing here. Pacific Theater is very much the budget game sequel to the budget game that was Deadly Dozen, and that's exactly what it should be, but digging deeper there are differences here, and some of them have profound effects on the game as a whole. So after selecting 4 guys out of the 12 and equipping each of them, the first thing I noticed about Pacific Theater is that they extended out the draw distance. It still isn't great, and a lot of the game still involves scanning fog, but it's much better than it was in the original game. I found myself getting the jump on enemies much more often here than in the first game. I felt like playing this is much less reactionary for this reason. If you could see an enemy in the first game, chances are they saw you first, but that's not the case this time around. AI behavior has been changed quite dramatically in order to make the enemies less like insanely difficult robots and more like actual humans who make mistakes. In practice, this means that enemies in the distance will sometimes try and get closer to you before taking their shots, which often happens if they have a close-range weapon like a submachine gun. They'll actually miss some of their shots sometimes, and like I said earlier, getting spotted by enemies simply doesn't happen as much. Because of this, the whole game is much easier than the first game, which is a fair enough call because the first game was a bit bullshit at times, but I think it was better being too hard than this game is being too easy. Yes, this game is too easy, which is a funny thing to say because if you hadn't played the first game and you started here, you absolutely wouldn't be saying that. It's just that the first game trained you into this basic gameplay loop of scanning the environment and healing appropriately, and if you know how to do that, then this can be a bit too breezy because that first game set the expected skill bar so damn high. Difficulty options are back, and again I found setting the damage realism to arcade and the difficulty to hard to be the best mix. Difficulty just controls AI behavior from what I can tell, and if damage realism is set to realistic, then the game just becomes super frustrating as you can get downed in one hit. So you're kind of choosing between ridiculously unfair or too easy, and I wanted to finish the game. I say that it's better to be a bit harder though, because Deadly Dozen's most shining moments sprout from stress and desperation. Remember those anecdotal stories cut into my review of the first game? Like when I had 4 guys left but had to use a 2-man bike, or when I fought my way through D-Day alone because all my teammates died? I don't really have any cool stories for Pacific Theater. Believe me, I wish I did. It was really fun telling them in that review, but simply put, nothing interesting happened in my 12-level playthrough, and the lowered difficulty is a part of the reason that is, but it's not the only reason, and it's not even the main reason. We got some level design issues up in this piece. Vehicles are back, and they function in exactly the same way. It's still super fun driving around and taking a break from all the more deliberate gunplay, but here's the kicker. Only a few levels actually have vehicles like the first game, and only one level actually uses them in an interesting way, which truly turns this game into a grind, and takes away more depth by limiting all that decision making the original game allowed for. What I assume is the reason for this is that they've introduced drivable tanks, which are much more prevalent. On paper, I love that they've introduced tanks. It's a logical addition to the game, but they're simply not fun to drive. They're far too slow, take too long to reload, and are way too volatile to the point where they're often simply not worth using. On the bright side, enemy tanks are now much more of a threat and fit their role as a mini-boss instead of being literally less threatening than a foot soldier, so that's good, but I'm saddened that all these dull, slow tank opportunities have taken the place of those fast, exciting driving parts from the first game. It's also disappointing because the game insists on having you travel long repetitive distances which would be perfect for vehicles. Almost every mission starts some kilometers away from the objective on the other side of the map with just randomly scattered enemies along the way, like Look at this level, why not just start me in front of the castle gates here, instead of making me walk through this boring green looking jungle section for no reason when there isn't even a single objective here. And that's another thing, almost every level looks exactly the same. They are green. I don't inherently dislike the idea of this game having a cohesive and consistent style or setting. I mean, Pacific Theater is in the title, and the atmosphere it achieves amidst the jungle is great at times, but the rare level which mixes up the visuals feels like such a breath of fresh air among the rest of the green boring levels. And one of the first game's biggest strengths was its visual variety. Pacific Theater's first 5 missions are very green, and in the briefing for the 6th mission, the game makes a joke about how so very green all the missions have been, so it puts you in a snow level. And this snow level is the most abhorrent piece of shit level in the game. For whatever reason, they thought including a compulsory stealth instant fail state if seen mission was a good idea. There's only one viable path you can take, which is found purely by trial and error, and even though I self-impose never using quicksave in this game, I just had to use it to get through this one level. I was on the verge of quitting. And to top it all off, the game returns to being boring and green without a hint of irony, and not once does it return to the snow. The first game had so much variety. It sent you to ancient Egyptian ruins, to a mansion estate, to a coastal village, to a rainy graveyard, and to a war-torn city. Actually, one of the later missions in Pacific Theater also places you in the middle of a war-torn city, and it's reminiscent of the original game. There's no lengthy boring walks or endless jungle, it's just you and your squad versus the world, and it's awesome. And that's the thing about Pacific Theater, there's flashes of brilliance and the potential to top the original game. The one mission which utilizes vehicles is early on in the game at an airport, and it's great. Another mission has you landing on Tarawa and has you caught in between enemies from all sides, and it requires some genuinely skillful and smart play to surpass, and that's really exciting and really interesting. Alongside the rare great level, production quality is up across the board. The visuals are better, characters are given more personality with unique models and voice lines during combat, the soundtrack and sound design is improved from what was already good, and we've even been blessed with actual reload animations. Some of the new ideas have really good intentions behind them, like the game will try surprise you with a katana-wielding enemy from the bushes, but because of the way the AI works, they never actually get close enough to hit you. You can equip your guys with a flamethrower or a sword, but there's no reason to ever do so with a limited inventory and the combat virtually always being long range. Locked doors have been added which can be opened with lockpicks, but the developers seem to forget this was even a mechanic after a few levels, as I stopped seeing locked doors entirely. Something I really liked though was the little funeral speeches the game would give for each character after they died. It really added a lot of flavour. Unfortunately, all this stuff is just not enough, or it's too few and far between, or it's just not that good, and Pacific Theater really just keeps shooting itself in the foot. For example, though the characters are given more personality, there are a few characters whose stats are way too good, meaning there's no real reason to use any of the other characters for any specific purpose. I cared about my healer in the original game because without him healing was a massive pain, and likewise for my sniper or my explosives guy, but here there are a few characters who are virtually perfect at all three, and it's not like all of those guys are gonna die because again, Pacific Theater is just too easy. In Deadly Dozen 1, if a teammate who's following you got stuck on geometry and got left behind, the game would just teleport him close to you, often without you even noticing. In Pacific Theater they've stopped doing this, so teammates get stuck all the time on everything, and it's up to you to stop what you're doing, switch to the stuck teammate, get them unstuck, catch them up to the rest of the team, and move on. This one small change has had such a profoundly bad effect on the game as a whole, and it sometimes feels like you can't go 20 meters without needing to do this. Even if there's no geometry to get stuck on, Pacific Theater has introduced an inventory weight system which has an impact on each of the characters' movement speeds, and if you're running in the open for a while and someone following you is simply too slow, there is a point where they'll just stop following you. Remember, these levels have you travelling pointlessly long distances with no cars and a jungle full of trees to get stuck on. There were times where I wanted to quit the game entirely because of this one problem, and the worst part is that it wasn't even an issue before. And that pretty much sums up my Pacific Theater experience. Most of the time, I just wanted to quit the game entirely, and when I didn't, I saw a sequel that could have and should have been better than the original. Between the lack of fun vehicles to drive, the rage-inducingly stupid teammates you need to babysit, and the overall poorly designed levels, Deadly Dozen Pacific Theater really falls flat. The charm the original game afforded, thanks to its good levels, pacing, and structure, is completely muted here, which in turn amplifies all the budget game shittiness on top of its other problems. There was so much room for improvement which wasn't capitalized on, and though the Deadly Dozen series ends here, N-Fusion Interactive would go on to develop 2 Vietnam games on the same engine, which are considered sort of as spiritual sequels: Line of Sight Vietnam and Elite Warriors Vietnam. Unfortunately, after playing this, and from what I've heard of those games, my venture into this obscure line of budget games ends here. If you're interested, play the original Deadly Dozen, and stay away from this game.